There's an old Earth saying, "An army marches on its stomach." Well, if that's the case, then surely the best way to defeat an army is make them go hungry. Greetings and welcome to this Dominion War special episode on raiding. We've talked previously about logistics in the Dominion War, and I've mentioned the raiding campaigns in the mainline videos. However, we haven't done a direct video looking at raiding specifically, so really you could consider this the opposite side of the coin to my video on logistics. We'll be covering a lot of the same ground from the other perspective, almost. This will also tie in pretty well with my videos on intelligence gathering and frigates. They're going to be pretty prominent. So, without any further ado, let's get right into it and discuss raiding in the Dominion War. The first question to ask is, when in a war does raiding take place? And, well, the simple answer is, well, any time. But it's ultimately a balance of opportunity and actionability. The opportunity may present itself, but you may not be able to action it. You may have the ability to action it, but there's no opportunity. And this will vary between whether or not you're on the offensive or on the defensive. If you're on the offensive, then you actually have an awful lot of opportunity. If you're, driving the enemy back very successfully, then their lines are going to be broken. It's going to be very easy to get behind them. But it's very difficult to action that because you yourself are having to advance. You yourself are stretching your own logistics train. Forget about even trying to go after the enemy's logistics train, considering that it's effectively always moving away from your main force. So it's going to take an awful lot to get it. Equally, on the defensive side, you obviously have the necessary resources to carry out raiding, particularly if you have been overrun. You can have units go to ground and just wait for the main enemy force to pass, and then pop up and take out their logistics. But of course, that's not a particularly survivable strategy, and you also don't have too many opportunities. Yes, on a defensive footing, the enemy is coming to you. They have to bring their supply assets further forwards, which does mean they're far easier to strike, but equally, you do basically almost have to run counter to the momentum. So the reality is that most of the time raiding takes place is on stagnant fronts, because there's a good balance of opportunity and actionability. As I say, on the offensive, your targets are always moving away from you, and it's very hard to go any faster than you're already going. Defensively, targets come to you, but of course, you can't survive. So that's why stagnant fronts, they offer the best balance. They offer a compromise of these two options. You effectively meet in the middle, and there's a pretty large window of opportunity. Offensives may last, a few weeks, whereas, of course, a stagnant situation can persist for months, and thus your window of opportunity to carry out raiding attacks is far greater. And of course you have a solidified front line to fall back to, so survivability is very good. So now I'm just going to talk a little bit about the history of raiding in the Dominion War. Raiding doesn't really actually begin in the Dominion War in earnest until the summer of 2374, and it is actually initiated by the Allies, with General Martok leading his famous cavalry raid. Now, it doesn't take too long for the Dominion to respond to this and start raiding attacks of their own. Dominion raiding efforts were most prevalent in the northern half of the Federation. This is for a couple of reasons. Mostly there's open space. There was neutral space where they could put their supply bases so that they could actually raid basically horizontally and bypass the front lines. And it also served to draw Federation reserves to the north, which then opened up the opportunity for the Calandra offensive in the south. So as well as obviously attacking the enemy's logistics and supply chains, it also serves a secondary strategic purpose. Come 2375, we see overall less raiding, but a lot more deep raids. The Breen attack on Earth, the Romulan firestorm. These are all pretty critical raiding campaigns that took place in 2375, but that were much more specific in what they were doing, and actually had much more ambitious targets. and fundamentally, raiding was integral to the final victory in 2376, with a combination of strategic raiding and interdiction by the Romulans. That's ultimately what helped make that breakthrough possible on the front lines, was that you had Romulan fleets that had infiltrated behind enemy lines and thus were able to then interdict the movement of reserves and prevent one front from reinforcing another. And then that very quickly split up Cardassian territory and created a series of pockets that were one by one subdued. So, as I've just implied, there are actually many different types of raiding, basically depending on what it is you're going after and what resources you have available to yourself. You have essentially, simply put, shallow, medium, and deep. And these are likely going to be carried out with different classes going after different kinds of targets. If we're looking at shallow raiding, what we're essentially looking at is taking out supply depots. We talked previously in the logistics episode about the sort of tree system, the root and trunk and branches, so that you have your root, which is all of your inputs, all of your industrial infrastructure, and they put together all the resources that are needed on the front lines. The trunk is then the convoy system, which moves this material to the front lines. And then, of course, we have the branches where you have these fleets fanned out across the front lines with their own supply bases and depots. And those are what you're going after in shallow raiding, is those immediate supply bases right on the front lines that are keeping the fleets in the fight. At the same time, you might also, as well as that, be going after specific ships, particularly, auxiliary ships, support ships, various logistics vessels. Because while those things aren't necessarily difficult to replace, it's more that, but you have to get it to the front lines again. And then they're going to have to go without that particular asset for potentially quite a long time, which again opens up opportunities for you. Then we have, of course, medium raiding, and that is basically to go after convoys. Obviously, essentially that's take out fuel, munition, components, all the critical things that are needed by starships on the front line. That's medium raiding. Basically, you're going after convoys. And then deep raiding is you're going after, the enemy's main industrial assets, shipyards, dilithium mines, factories, all these things which are actually, creating the material used in the war effort and that are probably way, way, way behind enemy lines. So, of course, the next question to answer is, how do you go about doing this? Well, there are an awful lot of ships that are available for raiding. Technically, you could use any ship you like to go on a raiding campaign. But I'm going to pick out a few that are perhaps significant and notable. So on the side of the Dominion, in terms of your shallow raiders, you're going to be using the Hideki and the Jem'Hadar fighter. That's not to say that you won't have bigger ships, but of course, the main thing about a shallow raid is its speed. It's boom, in and out very quickly. And the best way of doing that is using small attack ships, which can just move very quickly. And it's also very hard to see a raid coming because they're just so ubiquitous. They could be on a patrol, and then they just very quickly dart across the front lines. Okay, maybe not all of them survive, but, if they take the target, that's fine. They're relatively disposable assets, these small attack ships. So, that's what's used in shallow raiding for the Dominion. Then for your sort of shallow medium, these are ships that are probably going to support shallow raiding, probably actually effectively serve as the screen for the shallow raiders. So while the Hidekis and Jem'Hadar attack ships go about taking out the target, these are actually going to be trying to hold back any counterattack because they've got a little bit more tonnage behind them. And that's the Lakat and the Rysalak. And they're obviously relatively light destroyers, so they're perfectly happy running with attack ships. Then we move up to medium raiding, and this is where we see the Kulanor and Sartan frigates. Kulanor's obviously a bit older, but it does have a very good set of sensors on it, while the Sartan is a more direct combatant. Now, saying that, the Sartan never really got the opportunity to go on raids, but the Kulanor was a pretty critical part, particularly in that summer raiding campaign of the Dominion. It gave them an enormous amount of intelligence and tactical awareness. So they were really helpful in actually helping them find their targets, particularly when you're engaged in medium raiding, because of course you don't necessarily know exactly where the convoy is. Supply depot is a supply depot, it's not going to move. But the convoy is the most uncertain raiding. It's one of the most profitable to go after, but of course it moves. So it's the hardest to find. It's the one with the most amount of uncertainty, so that's really where the Kulanor comes in clutch. Then we have from the Breen, the Pleshbrek, which is their destroyer. It's a bit bigger than other destroyers, and all Breen ships are basically configured for raiding. Same goes, of course, with the Chelgret. That's a bit of a bigger cruiser. Well, I say cruiser, more like a frigate. And that's also capable of deep raiding. Really, the only deep raiding asset that the Dominion has is the Chimera class. Now, this has not appeared in any previous episodes, and that's because there were very few of them, and they were very seldom seen, and they never engaged in direct combat. These were basically spec ops ships designed to deliver stealthily and covertly Dominion assets, whether that was a Jem'Hadar strike team or potentially a changeling, to a critical location and then get out of there without anyone being any the wiser. Now, on the Allied side, we have, of course, a great deal of variety. Perhaps the most famous one is, of course, the Klingon Burrell, which is the most ubiquitous raider of all. It has the advantage that it, of course, has stealth, so infiltrating is a lot easier for it. It also means that it can lie in wait for, when the enemy try to launch raiding attacks. Then, of course, we have the Defiant class, which basically serves as the Federation's main spec ops platform, or at least those that have cloaking devices. Otherwise, it really serves as more of just a sort of heavyweight support for Klingon Burrells or other small attack ships. Then we have the Sabre, which is more of a medium, got good range, and actually it's much more of a counter raider rather than a raider in and of itself. Really, the best raiders in the Allied side are actually in the higher tonnage, where we have ships like the Centaur, which is a medium raider, very good, very fast, good light cruiser. The Cheyenne, again, really fast ship, and pretty powerful for the size. And then the frigates, the New Orleans and Intrepid, both of which, of course, have a long range. They've got an awful lot of reach, and they're basically miniature capital ships. So anything short of basically a heavy cruiser is not really going to phase them. I mean, against a New Orleans, you're probably going to have to match it with a Galor. With an Intrepid, you're probably going to need at least a squadron of Galors. Then we see the Klingons again with the Boreth, which is a medium-range raider. Klingons don't really have anything that's long-range, but critically, the Boreth, again, stupidly fast. In frontline combat, the Boreth didn't do particularly well in the Dominion War. It kind of suffered because it just wasn't up to par with, say, the Vocha, and sometimes would be used as if it was just a Vocha, which it simply wasn't. But when it was turned loose and allowed to be what it is, which is an incredibly fast raiding ship, it was very effective. And then from the Romulans, the main contribution are, of course, the Raptors, which are, massive ships, and no one else would consider a ship of that caliber as a raider. But the Romulans pretty routinely used them as their first strike asset, and they were very, very effective in that role, because, of course, if a Raptor drops cloak on top of you, what are you going to realistically do? Anything short of a Jem'Hadar battlecruiser is not making it out of there. And frankly, the Jem'Hadar battlecruiser is in for a tough fight. So that just brings me to the actual overall cycle of the raiding operation, which is pretty simple. You have to infiltrate past the enemy's skirmish screen. When you have all these fleets on the front line, they're not all just sat at their garrison planets, just, waiting for something to happen. They actively have ships and squadrons out on patrol to, actually form a coherent, solid front line. To such an extent that, they can probably see on their long-range sensors the enemy also on patrol. And so, you're both keeping tabs on each other, and you're both making observations about each other. Very frequently, these will, of course, develop from simply observing to actually engaging with the enemy. And so you have these running battles taking place, these skirmishes taking place, on essentially a daily basis in the Dominion War. And of course, that's where your opportunity to get your raiders through, that's where that comes in, because you can draw enemy ships out of position by baiting them into a skirmish before eventually, someone higher up the chain goes, oi, stop chasing kills, get back on patrol, let's hope that nobody snuck through the gap while you weren't looking. So that's a pretty critical part of the Dominion War, is the, daily skirmishes that take place on the front line. And that's ultimately how the raiders infiltrate. While cloaking devices are of course very helpful, it isn't just limited to those ships that are equipped with cloaking devices. So of course, once you bypass the enemy's skirmish screen and you infiltrate, you then simply advance to your target, however distant that may or may not be. Of course, the greater that you have to advance, you also have a greater chance of being detected and having to scrub the mission. Actually identifying the target, particularly when we're talking about convoys, that's a whole thing in and of itself, because of course you have to find the thing and it's moving. And, okay, you might have gotten good intelligence like the flight plan or the schedule, things can change and that intelligence could be out of date. And then you have to go looking, and that can be dangerous, obviously. And then, of course, once you do that, you have to eliminate the target and then get out of dodge. And that's how you do raiding in the Dominion War. So, a few final thoughts. With the vast size of fleets during the Dominion War, raiding is a more important role than ever before. As I say, a fleet marches on its stomach, and the fleets that we see in the Dominion War, well, they are very hungry beasts indeed, and supplies can make or break an advance, and it's ultimately through raiding that you can strengthen your own advance or stall an enemy advance. Now, of course, for every raid that you hear about, and you're only ever going to hear about the successful raids, or the romantically tragic raids, for those that you hear about, there were 20 others that were simply turned back because they couldn't get through the skirmish line. Raiding in the Dominion War is a game of numbers. You're countering the enemy's logistics, and you are making their spreadsheets complicated and unpleasant calculations. As well as that, of course, there's a strategic and morale impact to raiding. By conducting raids, you're doing something, you're making an active effort. Of course, the first raid in the Dominion War was the raid on Toros, on the Toros shipyards. And that was basically simply done so that Starfleet, as they knew they would have to fall back, had something that they could hold on to, a victory to hold on to get them through what was for them their darkest hour. And so while we can never really cover them all, just remember that every day in the Dominion War there are 1,000 mini battles taking place across the entire front lines, and daring raids being conducted on the daily, most of which fail, but they played an absolutely critical part in shaping the Dominion War. And fundamentally, I think we should just end on this thought. In the Dominion War, again, a war with massive Leviathan fleets of hundreds of ships smashing into each other, but with raiding campaigns, sometimes it just takes one ship to make the difference. So thank you all for watching. Leave your comments below. How would you conduct a raiding operation? How would you create a raiding fleet? Let me know in the comments below. See you all next time.